Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a group of people, right? Mentioned in one of the world's most influential sacred texts, the Qur'an. And they're mentioned right alongside Jews and Christians.
Yeah, exactly.
They're even deemed worthy of God's favor, like a pathway to salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Yet for most people today, their very name, Sabians, it just draws a complete blank.
It really does.
Intriguing, isn't it?
Okay.
To uncover such a significant yet, well, largely forgotten piece of history.
Indeed. And today we're embarking on a deep dive into the identity of these Sabians, a truly enigmatic group. Their story is far more complex, more fluid than just a simple footnote in history.
Right.
Our mission really is to piece together their narrative from, well, a fascinating stack of sources. We'll be looking at direct verses from the Qur'an itself, delving into the profound and actually often contrasting insights of Maimonides.
Maimonides, yeah.
And exploring various historical accounts from within the Islamic tradition. We even have clues from a really vivid travelogue from the 9th century.
Wow, 9th century.
Yeah. Our journey is going to reveal how interpretations of this group have shifted, like dramatically, over centuries. It exposes layers of theological debate, historical redefinition, and even some pretty shrewd political maneuvering.
You might think you have a solid grasp on what a religion of the book is, right? You probably picture a clear lineage, Abrahamic faiths, their definitive scriptures.
A standard picture, yeah.
But our exploration into the Sabians, it's going to profoundly challenge that very concept. I think it's going to give you a genuine aha moment about how faiths evolve, how their identities are constructed, and how they're understood or, misunderstood across time. By the end of this deep dive, you'll have a much richer understanding, not just of who the Sabians might have been, but also of the surprisingly complex, often fluid, and sometimes politically charged nature of religious identity itself. So as we begin this fascinating exploration, what immediately jumps out at you?
Well, what immediately strikes me and what really sets the stage for our entire discussion is the significant discrepancy. The difference between how the Sabians are portrayed in the earliest Islamic texts, specifically the Qur'an, and then later interpretations, particularly those that became dominant in Jewish scholarship like Maimonides and even some later Islamic scholarship.
Okay, that difference is key.
It is. This alone tells us that the definition of religious groups, even ones explicitly mentioned in foundational sacred texts, it's far from static. It's not some fixed label handed down through the ages, unchanging.
Right, not set in stone.
Exactly. Instead, it's a dynamic process. It's shaped by theological shifts, by historical encounters, political pressures, evolving scholarly understanding. This discrepancy, this difference, that's the central mystery we're trying to unravel today.
That dynamic nature is precisely what makes this so captivating. It really is like a historical detective story.
It kind of is, yeah.
Where the identity of our subject just keeps changing, depending on the lens we're looking through. And here's where it gets really interesting right at the outset. The Qur'an, in surahs like Al-Baqarah 2.62 and Al-Ma'idah 5.69, it places the Sabians right there, explicitly.
Listed by name.
Alongside those who believed, meaning early Muslims, the Jews, and the Nazarene, which means Christians. But it's not just a casual mention, is it? These verses deliver an incredibly powerful, almost inclusive message.
Absolutely.
They state that whoever believed in God in the last day and does good will have their wage at their Lord, no fear on them, nor they be sad. I mean, that's a direct promise of salvation, a pathway to divine favor.
Based on belief and action, yeah.
Right. Based on core belief and righteous deeds, regardless of their specific community name or faith group label, it feels like this open-ended promise of salvation that seems to extend beyond just Judaism and Christianity. It suggests a broader tent, maybe, for God's favor.
And what's truly fascinating here, adding another layer, is that another verse, Surah Al-Hajj 22.120, also lists them, but in a slightly different context, though equally significant. Here, they're mentioned alongside Jews, Nazarenes, Magians, that's Zoroastrians and associators.
Associators. Like polytheists.
Exactly. Those who associate partners with God. Essentially polytheists or idolaters. And this verse concludes saying, God will decide between them on the day of resurrection.
Okay, so that list is broader.
It is. Now, the immediate implication of the first two verses you mentioned, Al-Baqarah and Al-Ma'idah, it seems undeniably clear. The Sabians are not idolaters. They're put in the category of those who can achieve salvation, people of a legitimate faith.
Right.
But this creates a profound puzzle, because if they're not idolaters, and the Qur'an in Surah 22.18 explicitly condemns star worshippers, stating, "Have you not seen that to God prostrate those who are in the heavens and in the earth, the sun, the moon, the stars?"
It condemns worshipping stars specifically.
Right. So if the Sabians aren't those star-worshipping idolaters, then what was their specific form of monotheism? This raises an absolutely fundamental question. If they're not pagans, if they're explicitly contrasted with idolaters who worship celestial bodies, then who were they? And what exactly did their belief system entail to earn them such a favorable, almost privileged mention in the Qur'an?
It's a real theological riddle.
It is. And it's one that has intrigued and frankly divided scholars for centuries.
It really is a profound mystery. Most of us, we're quite familiar with Jews and Christians, their histories, their scriptures, their prophets. We have a general idea.
Common knowledge, more or less.
But the Sabians, they remain largely unknown, almost like a phantom group, especially given their prominent and positive Quranic mention.
Yeah, it's strange.
How could such a significant group, recognized in the foundational text of Islam as essentially a legitimate people of the book, just seemingly vanish from common knowledge or become so shrouded in ambiguity? It's like finding a key character in an ancient story whose identity has been, I don't know, deliberately erased or obscured or maybe even strategically redefined over time.
Right.
It really makes you wonder about the powerful forces, both theological and political, that shape our historical and religious understanding. Who gets remembered and how?
And this brings us neatly to that starkly contrasting view, one that profoundly shaped Western perceptions and even some significant Islamic perceptions of the Sabians for centuries. But we connect this to the bigger picture. One of the most influential interpretations comes from Maimonides.
Ah, Maimonides again, the 12th century Jewish philosopher.
Exactly. Towering figure, legal scholar, physician. His works, particularly his legal code, Mishneh Torah, and his philosophical masterpiece, The Guide for the Perplexed, were incredibly influential across all Abrahamic traditions.
Hugely influential.
Now, for him, polytheism wasn't just, a loose collection of different beliefs here and there. He argued the opposite, that polytheism, far from being plural or diverse, constituted a fixed and binding system of erroneous beliefs which afflicted all humanity. A whole system.
A system, okay, not just random practices.
Right. A coherent, though wrong, system. And he specifically designates this universal system of idolatry as the religion of the Sabians, a religion that embraced the whole earth.
Wow. The whole earth. That's a huge claim.
It's a sweeping generalization. He's painting them not just as idolaters, but as the archetypal idolaters, the very essence of human deviation from pure monotheism.
That is a very different picture from the Quranic one.
Absolutely stark contrast.
So, for Maimonides, the Sabians were the quintessential idolaters, the embodiment of polytheism rooted in these wrong ideas about the cosmos. That is a stark, almost irreconcilable contrast to how they appear in the Quran, where they're presented as potential monotheists, alongside Jews and Christians, people worthy of salvation.
Polar opposites.
It's a massive divergence. It's like calling the same group both, I don't know, angels and demons?
Pretty much.
What exactly did their system entail, according to him? What were they supposedly doing? And, maybe even more critically for our deep dive into how history gets written, where did Maimonides get this information?
Right. Was it firsthand?
Yeah. Did he have direct contact? Or was he relying on earlier texts that might have already, shifted the understanding?
That's the crucial question. And Maimonides' primary source for this incredibly detailed description of Sabian idolatry. It wasn't contemporary observation. It was the Arabic translation of a much older text known as the Book of Nabatean Agriculture.
Nabatean agriculture. The Nabateans,
Yeah.
Petra, right, southern Jordan.
Exactly, those Nabateans, the famous rock-cut city builders. They were an ancient Arabic-speaking people. And this agricultural treatise, which likely dates from a period much earlier than Maimonides, maybe Hellenistic or Roman times, it provided him with what he believed was an authentic window into this ancient polytheistic world.
He took it literally then.
He seems to have taken its descriptions of astral cults and agricultural rituals as a literal depiction of the Sabian religion itself. He describes their cult with remarkable specificity. He says they raise statues to the planets, golden statues to the sun, and silver statues to the moon.
Gold for the sun, silver for the moon. Very specific.
Very specific. And it wasn't just abstract worship. It was a highly organized, systematic belief system, according to him. His annotator, a scholar named Monk, clarifies this further. He explains they distributed the metals and climates to the planets, believing such a planet is the god of such a climate.
Okay, so assigning metals and climates to planets. Sounds a bit like astrology or...
Exactly. They assigned one of 7 metals, gold, silver, copper, lead, iron, tin, and something called carcini. which is identified as Mercury, to each of the 7 classical planets. They believe these planets influence climates and, quite intriguingly, even participated directly in the formation of metals underground.
Wow, that sounds a lot like medieval alchemy, doesn't it?
It's deeply intertwined with early medieval alchemical thought, yes. So, for Maimonides, the Sabian religion wasn't just simple idol worship. It was profoundly integrated with astrological practices and these kind of proto-scientific ideas. It formed a comprehensive worldview, albeit in his view, an utterly erroneous one, the root of all idolatry.
That's an astonishing level of detail from Maimonides based on this Nabatean text, but it absolutely deepens the puzzle for us, doesn't it?
It really does.
How can the Qur'an portray them as potential monotheists worthy of salvation, while Maimonides, centuries later, describes them as the absolute epitome of idolatry, deeply involved in astrology and these alchemy-like practices?
Yeah, the disconnect is huge.
It feels like we're talking about 2 entirely different groups of people, both just happening to be called Sabians, or maybe the term itself just underwent a radical transformation in meaning over time.
That's what the evidence starts to suggest.
It makes you wonder if there was a strategic reason, or at least a culturally driven reason, for this dramatic redefinition of their identity.
Well, to truly understand this profound discrepancy, this evolving identity, we really need to trace the evolution of how Muslims themselves understood the Sabians. It wasn't a static concept, like we said. It changed significantly across centuries. It reflected new encounters, scholarly debates, political realities.
It's history unfolding.
Exactly. A prominent scholar named 𝘉𝘰𝘬, he actually classifies Muslim conceptions of the Sabians into 3 distinct historical periods, each one reflecting changing interpretations and, frankly, a growing ambiguity surrounding who they really were. Let's trace this fascinating historical journey.
Okay, let's trace this journey. It's like watching a historical identity just morph right before our eyes. Let's start with the earliest period. From the time of Muhammad himself, maybe up until around 830, 831 AD, what was the initial understanding then? Who did people think these Sabians were? Was it clear or already a mystery?
During this foundational period, Muhammad is widely understood by scholars based on early Islamic sources to have considered the Sabians to be the Mandaeans.
The Mandaeans. Okay, who were they?
They were a specific, identifiable religious sect from southern Mesopotamia, so modern-day Iraq, roughly. The Mandaeans claimed to be direct followers of John the Baptist, whom they revered as their main prophet.
Ah, John the Baptist. Not Jesus, not Moses.
Exactly. They positioned themselves as distinct from Christians, but crucially, like Jews and Christians, they based their faith on a revealed text. Specifically, their sacred scriptures, like the 𝘉𝘰𝘰𝘬, the Great Treasure.
They had a book?
They had a book. And this crucial detail aligns perfectly with the Quranic portrayal of them as people of the book, al-Kitab, a monotheistic group with a sacred scripture, deserving of that favorable status alongside Jews and Christians in those early Quranic verses.
That makes sense.
So this initial understanding points to a relatively specific and consistent identity for the Sabians in the very early Islamic period. Their focus on ritual purity, lots of water immersion, their reverence for John the Baptist. It made them unique, but still within that acceptable framework for early Muslims.
So the Mandaeans were likely the original Sabians mentioned in the Quran, a distinct monotheistic group, own text, own prophet.
That seems to be the strongest scholarly consensus for the initial period, yes.
That makes a lot of sense in light of those Quranic verses promising them salvation. But what happened next? Did this clear understanding last? Or did the identity of the Sabians begin to shift and become more ambiguous as the Islamic Empire expanded and encountered, more diverse groups?
Well, interestingly, when we look at Muslim historians from the 3rd century of the Hijra, that's the Islamic calendar, so roughly the 9th century AD, they almost completely omit any mention of the Sabians as a specific, identifiable group. It's strange.
They just disappear from the records?
Almost. It's as if that clear early identity had kind of faded from immediate recognition or documentation, or perhaps they were just being lumped into other categories. We don't fully know. However, by the 4th century of the Hijra, so moving into the 10th century AD, a significant divergence appears in the historical accounts.
Okay, what changes?
Scholars and chroniclers at that time started to identify 2 distinct kinds of Sabians. Not just one group anymore.
2 kinds.
Yeah. One group was described as practicing a mixture of Judaism, Christianity, and Mazdeism, the ancient Persian religion of Zoroaster. These individuals were said to believe in Jesus and read Psalms. It suggests a kind of syncretic group, blending traditions, but maybe still broadly monotheistic or Abrahamic adjacent.
Okay, a blend. And the other kind.
The other group, however, was explicitly identified as not believing in prophecies or revealed texts. And crucially, they worshiped the sun and planets.
Ah, star worshippers.
Pagans.
Clearly recognized as pagans or idolaters. Precisely the kind of star worshippers condemned elsewhere in the Quran. So this period marks a critical shift, a growing ambiguity, a splitting of the Sabian identity into two very different categories. One potentially monotheistic or syncretic, and the other overtly polytheistic and star-worshipping. It's a moment where a single name starts to mean contradictory things. And what about the period that brings us closer to Maimonides' time, say, from the 10th century AD onwards? How did the understanding evolve then? Did that pagan interpretation start to win out? Did it become the dominant view?
Precisely. From the 10th century AD onwards, which is exactly when Maimonides was active and drawing on these historical threads, the pagan interpretation didn't just gain traction, it became widely promoted by historians. It kind of took over.
It became the main story.
Yeah. They began to talk about Sabians who, they claimed, existed way back in the time of Abraham, ancient pagans. And more significantly, they started to broadly describe all pagans of antiquity as Sabians.
All pagans. Just lump them all together under that name.
Pretty much, especially those involved in astral worship. It became a generalized, almost catch-all label for anyone practicing ancient idolatry, regardless of their actual historical connection to the original Quranic Sabians, the Mandaeans, or even the 𝘉𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘬 we'll discuss.
So the term just got stretched incredibly thin.
Completely. This redefinition provided a convenient historical and theological framework for scholars like Maimonides. It allowed them to identify the Sabians as the quintessential idolaters, the very antithesis of true monotheism, a stark contrast to that initial Quranic picture.
And the shift wasn't accidental, you're saying?
Probably not entirely. It served a purpose, to clearly delineate the boundaries of accepted monotheism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, from what was now being framed as ancient, universal error, all conveniently labeled Sabian.
So if we trace this whole semantic journey, we've gone from a specific, identifiable monotheistic group with a revealed text, the Mandaeans, fitting Muhammad's initial understanding, to a split understanding. Two types of Sabians, one sort of syncretic, one definitely pagan.
Right.
And finally, to this broad, almost catch-all term for all ancient pagans, especially star worshippers, stretching back to Abraham.
That's a trajectory.
That's a huge, almost unbelievable semantic journey for a single name.
It really is remarkable.
It's like the name Sabian became this blank canvas, and different historical periods, theological agendas, maybe political needs, just projected their own definitions onto it.
And this fascinating trajectory raises another important question, doesn't it? Why would a group, particularly one maybe facing persecution, adopt such a fluctuating or generalized identity?
Right. Why take on a name that's becoming associated with paganism, unless
it offered some kind of advantage. It speaks to the incredible power of labels and the pragmatic, sometimes desperate use of religious categories just for survival. And there's a truly fascinating account from a 9th century traveler that gives us a crucial clue here.
the travelogue you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. He visited Harran, a city also in southern Mesopotamia, modern Turkey, near the Syrian border. Harran was historically famous as a center of ancient pre-Islamic pagan religion, especially astral worship. They were known for it.
The 𝘉𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘬? Okay.
And this traveler recounted that in the specific years, 830-831 AD, the people there were still practicing their traditional 𝘉𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘬 religion. And legally, under Islamic law, they were categorized as neither Muslim, Christian, Jewish, nor Mazdeist. They didn't fit any of the protected, revealed religion boxes.
And they were in a serious bind then, right? Because Caliph al-Ma'mun, during this period, he was known for his interest in philosophy and science, the Mu'tazilite theology.
Right, the House of Wisdom era.
But he was also apparently on a mission to consolidate Islamic identity and persecute anyone not belonging to a recognized, revealed religion.
Exactly. The al-Kitab, the people of the book, had protected dhimmi status. They paid a tax, the jizya, but their communities and faiths were legally tolerated.
But if you weren't one of them.
If you weren't one of them, you faced severe consequences, potentially forced conversion, or worse, especially if the ruler was cracking down.
So these people in Harran were essentially stateless, religiously speaking, under the caliph system, and under existential threat from a powerful ruler questioning their legitimacy.
Precisely. They were in a very dangerous position. And in this dire situation, according to the account, they received some shrewd, pragmatic advice from a Muslim jurist.
A Muslim lawyer helped them?
Apparently so.
Hmm.
He advised them to strategically adopt the Quranic name Sabians.
Ah. Use the name from the Quran itself.
Exactly. It was a brilliant, if maybe desperate, legal and political maneuver. By claiming the identity of a group already mentioned favorably in the Quran, even if their actual beliefs didn't match the original Mandaeans, they could argue for legal protection under the caliph's own framework. They could claim al-Kitab status or something close enough to ensure their survival.
Wow, that's clever.
It strongly suggests that for some, maybe many, the name Sabians became a designation of convenience, a protective umbrella, a strategic self-labeling that didn't necessarily reflect a shared theology with the original Quranic Sabians, the Mandaeans, or even align with Maimonides' later damning version of idolatry.
To just fit the legal loophole they needed.
It highlights how religious identity can be surprisingly fluid, profoundly subject to political and social pressures, sometimes completely divorced from strict theological adherence.
That's an incredible, almost chilling example. How a label can be weaponized or maybe repurposed just for survival, regardless of its original meaning or even whether the people adopting it truly believed what the original group believed.
It happens.
It makes you wonder how many historical identities were shaped, not purely by theological evolution or spiritual conviction, but by sheer political necessity. By the need to fit into a pre-existing legal or social category simply to avoid persecution. It's a powerful reminder that history is rarely as neat and tidy as we'd like to think. Identities are constantly being negotiated, contested, sometimes strategically deployed.
Indeed. And it wasn't just external pressures like the callous decree shaping this identity. There were also internal theological attempts to make sense of it all, to reconcile the disparate views. Almost a century before Maimonides, Muhammad al-Shahrastani.
Shahrastani, okay. An Iranian scholar.
Yes, a highly influential Iranian scholar and historian of religions. He lived in the 11th and 12th centuries. He offered yet another perspective, one that actually tried to bridge some of these deep differences we've been talking about.
How did he try to square the circle?
He theorized that within Sabaism itself, there was a fundamental distinction, a split within the group. He suggested the Sabian elite were true monotheists, perhaps adhering to a more abstract, philosophical, maybe even esoteric understanding of God, while the pagan commoners worshipped the planets and engaged in the more obvious exoteric ritualistic practices that observers like Maimonides or his sources described.
Okay, so al-Shahrastani was proposing that Sabaism wasn't this single monolithic religion, but one with different layers, different levels of understanding or practice maybe, kind of like esoteric and exoteric traditions you see in other faiths, like Sufism in Islam or Kabbalah in Judaism.
Exactly like that. That's a very good analogy.
That's a really insightful way to try and bridge the gap, isn't it? Between the Quranic portrayal of potential monotheists and Maimonides' description of widespread idolaters.
It is.
It allows for both pictures to be true, in a sense. It just depends on which segment of the Sabian population you were looking at or whose writings you were reading.
Precisely. Al-Shahrastani's nuanced view suggests that Sabaism might have encompassed a whole spectrum of beliefs and practices. From a refined, perhaps philosophical monotheism among its learned elite, down to more accessible, maybe syncretic, or even overtly pagan practices among its common followers. This view doesn't just attempt to reconcile the seemingly contradictory Quranic and Maimonidean accounts. It also reflects a pattern we often see in many ancient religions, where a priestly or intellectual class might hold more abstract, sophisticated theological views than the popular cult practices of the general populace.
Right, the elite versus the folk religion.
Exactly. It just adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of this group, whose identity was continuously being redefined, both from the outside and perhaps from within.
Fascinating. So the complexity wasn't just external historical interpretation getting it wrong or changing, but potentially an internal stratification within the religion itself.
That's what al-Shahrastani suggests, yeah.
It's a testament to the diverse ways spiritual paths can manifest and evolve.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, thinking about these potentially layered beliefs, maybe esoteric elements, we can probably conclude that Sabiism, in its various historical forms and interpretations, was arguably the first of the so-called Gnostic religions to really appear and develop within the Islamic world.
Gnostic. Okay, that term carries a lot of weight. You mean like hidden knowledge, esoteric teachings?
Exactly. In this sense, the Sabians could be seen as intellectual and spiritual predecessors to later, maybe better-known groups. Groups like the Alawites in Syria, the Druze in the Levant, maybe even arguably the Sikhs in South Asia, groups often characterized by their unique, sometimes secretive, esoteric traditions.
And what defines these Gnostic traits, broadly speaking? The traits that allowed these groups to persist, often in challenging environments, against the backdrop of more dominant Orthodox faiths. The source mentions their theology is partially occult and reserved for initiates. Does that imply a deliberate strategy for survival, a way to protect their distinct identity by keeping it hidden?
Exactly. That's a key aspect. These are often religions that developed an internal, sometimes deeply complex esoteric knowledge, gnosis. This knowledge was typically kept hidden from outsiders. It was shared only among a select, often carefully vetted group of initiates.
So not for public consumption.
Not at all. This secrecy, this occult or hidden nature of their core theology, it allowed them to survive despite the persecutions of intolerant monotheism, as the source puts it, by not openly displaying their full doctrines, or maybe by presenting a more acceptable exoteric face to the outside world, the dominant powers. They could potentially avoid direct confrontation or suppression by larger, more singular religious systems that might see them as heretical or dangerous.
So secrecy becomes a powerful protective mechanism.
It does. It allows for the preservation of distinct spiritual paths that might otherwise have been just wiped out by assimilation or force.
It's a powerful observation. Actually, the source even calls intolerant monotheism a pleonasm.
Yes, it does make that rather pointed comment.
A pleonasm meaning like the words intolerant and monotheism inherently mean the same thing, or that intolerance is built into monotheism. That's quite a provocative statement.
It is provocative. It's suggesting that perhaps a claim of exclusive, singular truth inherently carries within it a tendency towards intolerance when it encounters alternative paths or different truth claims.
Right. If you believe you have the only truth.
Then other truths become problematic, potentially dangerous. Certainly a strong way to phrase it, and it really highlights the existential challenges these Gnostic-leaning groups, maybe including some versions of the Sabians, face throughout history from more dominant singular faiths.
It does. It underscores that historical reality. When a religion claims exclusive truth, and especially when it holds political power, it frequently struggles to accommodate alternative paths that leads to tension and, all too often, to persecution.
So the occult or hidden nature of these traditions, then, it wasn't just about mysticism. It became a very practical, strategic response to that historical pressure, a survival technique.
Okay, so this whole discussion of the Sabians being people of the book, but then maybe not, or maybe only some of them, or maybe it was a political label. And this idea of shifting definitions, political convenience, secret knowledge, it leads us to a much larger concept, one that's often just thrown around, taken for granted in common discourse.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this. What do we really mean when we casually say religion of the book?
Yeah, it's a term we hear all the time.
It seems like such a straightforward label, doesn't it? A clear-cut category. But our whole deep dive into the Sabians has already massively complicated it.
It really has. And most people, if you ask them what a book is, they might default to the kind of definition you'd find in a standard dictionary, like the Larousse definition mentioned in the source. A collection of printed sheets gathered into a volume, stapled or bound.
Right, the physical object, paper and ink.
Exactly. It's a purely physical description. It doesn't consider the content at all. It's just a material object.
Yeah.
But when we talk about religions of the book, in a theological or historical sense, we usually imply something far deeper, don't we?
Yeah, much more profound.
We imply a shared fundamental truth, maybe a direct divine revelation, a singular origin, perhaps a common lineage through a prophetic tradition that comes from a single perfect text. We often assume this singularity of purpose and origin for these texts, a divine intention that dictates their form and content. But let's look closer at the books themselves.
Okay, let's compare these books that are often grouped together under this umbrella. Religions of the book. Judaism, Christianity, Islam. What about the Judaic Bible, the Tanakh? Is it a single monolithic book in the way we might casually imagine a book of a religion?
No, it's really quite the opposite of a singular monolithic work. The source describes it aptly not as a single book, but as a small library, an anthology of diverse and varied texts.
A library, okay, I like that description.
Within its covers, you find an incredible range of genres, styles, purposes. It reflects centuries of communal life, spiritual evolution, historical events. Some texts are about intricate laws and commandments, Leviticus, parts of Deuteronomy. Others recount history, kings, chronicles. Then you have deeply pietistic poems expressing devotion or lament the Psalms. You even have erotic love poetry like the Song of Songs.
Right, Song of Songs is in there.
And wisdom literature like Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, contemplating life's meaning or maybe lack thereof from various philosophical viewpoints. Intriguingly, there are even fictional stories, narratives with clear political content, like the Book of Esther, which, surprisingly, doesn't even mention God explicitly.
Esther doesn't mention God. Wow.
Not directly, no. And then you have narratives like Job or parts of Daniel that don't even take place in Israel. And in the case of Job, we don't even know for sure if the main characters are explicitly Jewish, the prophetic books. They're mostly collections of impassioned warnings, moral critiques, promises delivered by different individuals over long stretches of time.
So it's a real mix.
It's a huge mix. So the unifying factor, the thread that really binds these disparate texts together into the Bible, it seems to be, as the source suggests, that at the time the canon was being formed, the Jewish people simply loved to read these texts. They revered their insights, their stories, their poetry, their laws, and collectively decided they wanted to preserve these specific ones for future generations.
So it was a process of selection and preservation by the community.
Very much so. It's a testament to a community's evolving relationship with its own sacred narrative, rather than a single divinely dictated volume dropped from the sky.
That's a powerful point about curation and communal love, a very human element in the sacred, you could say. Okay, what about the New Testament? Does it conform more to that singular book idea? Or is it similarly a collection of diverse writings from the early Christian movement?
The New Testament is also very much a collection, a compilation of documents reflecting that vibrant and sometimes contested early Christian movement. It starts with multiple biographies of Jesus, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, each offering a distinct perspective, a different emphasis on his life and teachings.
4 different versions, basically.
4 different portraits, yeah. Then you have numerous letters, the epistles, written by early Christian leaders like Paul, Peter, John, James, written to various emerging Christian communities across the Roman Empire, offering guidance, doctrine, encouragement, sometimes correction as the faith spread.
Practical advice for new churches.
Very practical, often addressing specific problems or questions. Following that, you have the Acts of the Apostles, which is basically a history book. It chronicles the early spread of Christianity, focusing on Peter and especially Paul after Jesus' ascension. And finally, you have Revelation, the Apocalypse of John, a complex symbolic text of prophecy announcing, well, the end of time and God's final victory.
So again, a real collection, different genres, different authors, different purposes.
Absolutely. A diverse collection of genres and purposes penned by multiple authors over several decades. It reflects the multifaceted origins and the early development, the growing pains even, of the Christian faith. It's not a singular, continuous narrative dictated at one moment. It's a testament to the dynamic, unfolding life of that early community and its key figures.
Okay. Then we come to the Qur'an. We often hear it described differently, right? As the singular, perfectly preserved revelation, distinct from a collection of writings, the direct word of God.
That is the traditional Islamic understanding, yes.
How does it compare then in structure and origin to these other foundational texts we've just discussed? And what does the source we're looking at tell us about its compilation? Because that seems key.
Right. The Qur'an is indeed often presented within the Islamic tradition as unique and directly distinct from these collections. Structurally, it's rather short compared to the Bible, with 114 surahs or chapters. It's often described as repetitive in its core messages and themes, the absolute oneness of God, Tawhid, warnings of judgment, stories of prophets. It claims an absolute divine origin, uncreated, co-eternal with God, according to some schools of thought. It's monothematic in its singular focus on God's oneness, and it asserts a universal message for all humanity.
So that's the traditional view, but does the source complicate this?
It does. Here's where it gets really interesting and significantly complicates that straightforward, perfect book narrative. The source highlights what it calls its illegibility and incomprehensibility in its current disseminated state, if you try to read it looking for chronological or narrative consistency.
Illegibility, that's a strong word.
It means difficult to follow logically or chronologically as presented. Because during Muhammad's lifetime, the revelations were not gathered into a single bound volume. That didn't happen. They were written down piecemeal as they were revealed on whatever materials were available.
Like the camel shoulder blades you mentioned.
Exactly. Fragile papyrus, bits of parchment, palm leaves, flat stones, even dried camel shoulder blades, whatever was at hand. And critically, when Muhammad died rather suddenly, the knowledge of the original chronological order in which these surahs, or even parts of surahs, had been revealed, that knowledge was apparently lost or at least not systematically recorded or agreed upon by the entire community.
The order wasn't known for sure.
Which posed a monumental challenge for the early Muslim community trying to preserve and organize the revelation accurately. So the current edition of the Quran, the one widely used today, known as the Uthmanic Codex, it was largely compiled and imposed as the authoritative version by the third Caliph Uthman around 650 AD, maybe finalized closer to 694 AD, so roughly 2 to 3 decades after Muhammad's death.
Okay, compiled after his death. How was it organized?
Well, in this compilation process, a crucial editorial decision was made. All the surahs, except for the very first one, the short opening prayer Al-Fatiha, they were placed in succession generally from the longest surah to the shortest surah.
Longest to shortest. Not chronologically.
Not chronologically at all. This editorial choice completely disregarded the original order of revelation, which many argue is vital for understanding the context, the reasons, as Bab al-Nuzul, and the potential evolution of the verses over Muhammad's prophetic career.
So the context got jumbled.
The source calls the result a jumbled mixture that does not take into account the context in which the verses were originally revealed. It often groups verses on very different topics, revealed at different times, together simply because they happen to fall within one of the longer surahs placed earlier in the book.
That sounds potentially confusing for interpretation.
It can be. And furthermore, adding another layer of complexity, the Shiites, a major branch of Islam, fundamentally questioned the very readability and, crucially, the completeness of this Uthmanic compiled Qur'an.
They think parts are missing.
They maintain that the first compiler, Abu Bakr, or possibly Uthman, depending on the tradition, deliberately omitted a large number of verses, or even whole surahs. Specifically, surahs concerning Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, the figure absolutely central to Shiite legitimacy. And they believe these crucial texts are now lost forever.
Wow. That's a huge claim from a major part of the Muslim world.
It is, and it raises an extremely important question. If the original order of revelation is disputed, and if significant parts of the content are believed by a large portion of the faithful to be missing or deliberately excluded, how does that affect the idea of a singular, perfect, unblemished book and its direct divine origin? Especially when you compare it to the way other scriptural traditions, like the Bible, openly acknowledge their complex compilation history.
Right. It complicates the narrative significantly.
It transforms the idea of the book from maybe a pristine, static object into something profoundly shaped by human agency, historical circumstances, political decisions, and interpretative choices. It reveals the often messy reality behind the compilation of sacred texts.
That's an astonishing insight into the Quran's compilation, especially the detail about the longest to shortest ordering and the Shiite claims of lost content.
It's based on historical scholarship and internal Islamic debates, yeah.
It really challenges the common perception many might hold of a singular, perfectly ordered, divinely dictated text. It forces us, or at least invites us, to acknowledge the human hand, the historical process involved in even the most sacred of traditions.
So if we pull back again and look at the broader implications of all this, speaking of religions of the book in a strict theological sense beyond just meaning religions that have a physical book, it actually means very little, according to this analysis. Why? Because these foundational sacred texts, as we've just seen, the source argues they have nothing comparable between them.
Nothing comparable? In what way?
In terms of their structure, anthology versus single narrative claim, their compilation process, gradual community curation versus post-prophetic compilation with ordering issues, their historical development, or even the sheer variety and nature of their content.
They're just too different internally.
It's fundamentally different, the argument goes. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes clear that it's somewhat arbitrary for Muslims, or frankly anyone, to limit this notion of religion of the book solely to their own religion, Christianity and Judaism. The historical and textual evidence, when examined closely, simply doesn't seem to support such an exclusive grouping based purely on the nature of their respective books.
It's like trying to group, I don't know, apples, oranges, and maybe a complex philosophical treatise together just because they all come with a cover.
That's a good analogy. The container might look vaguely similar book, but the contents, their origins, their internal logic are fundamentally different.
And why is it arbitrary, according to the source? We touched on this, but let's reiterate. Because, as we've already explored with the Sabians, they clearly had numerous religious texts themselves, right? especially in that early Quranic understanding as Mandaeans.
Exactly. They fit the people with a book description initially. They had their own scriptures, their own body of sacred knowledge.
And what about a major ancient religion like Mazdeism, Zoroastrianism? Where does that fit into this seemingly exclusive club? They were mentioned in that Quranic list, too.
Precisely. Mazdaism, the ancient religion of Zoroaster, possesses the Zendavesta, which is described in our sources as a great monotheistic religious text, a substantial body of sacred scripture detailing cosmology, laws, hymns, prayers.
A monotheistic text.
Yes. And in fact, some scholars even argue that Zoroastrian monotheism, or perhaps dualism, might have been the origin or at least a major influence on Jewish monotheism, and by extension, other monotheistic traditions that followed.
So it might even be the earliest monotheistic scripture, arguably.
Arguably, yes, which begs a critical question. If the criteria for being considered a people of the book include having sacred texts and adhering to some form of monotheism, why were groups like the Sabians, in their various forms, and the Mazdeans often excluded from that privileged category, or redefined, pushed to the margins, sometimes even recategorized as pagan idolaters, while Judaism and Christianity generally retained that protected status within mainstream Islamic discourse and law?
It points away from pure theology, doesn't it?
It forces us to confront the political dimensions, the social factors, the dynamics of power involved in religious categorization, rather than just assuming it's all based on objective theological criteria.
It suggests that who gets labeled a people of the book isn't just a matter of divine decree or textual fact, but also deeply embedded in historical context, political expediency, and the ever-shifting landscape of religious authority and boundary making.
Wow, okay. Our deep dive into the mysterious Sabians has really shown us just how slippery religious identity can be.
It's like trying to grasp smoke sometimes. Especially when it crosses these complex historical, theological, and political lines. We've seen them shift so dramatically, from maybe a specific Mandaean sect recognized as monotheistic with a revealed text in early Islam, to becoming this broad, almost generic label for ancient pagans in later scholarship, influenced by Quranic mentions, yes, but also hugely by Maimonides' formidable intellectual work, and even by direct political maneuvering in Iran, just a strategy for sheer survival.
All those factors played a role.
And in digging into all that, we've been compelled to challenge our very definition of what truly constitutes a religion of the book.
Yeah.
We've had to peel back layers of assumptions about scripture, about compilation, about divine intention, about the neat categories we thought existed.
And this raises, I think, an important and perhaps unsettling question for all of us listening today. If the very notion of a book religion is itself so fluid, so demonstrably subject to historical interpretation, selective compilation, shifting definitions, even political pressures, what does that imply about the stability and the exclusivity of other religious categories we often take for granted today?
Good question. Are any labels truly fixed?
It prompts us to consider that what we understand is a fixed, unchanging religious identity, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever, might in fact be a continuous negotiation, a dynamic interplay between texts, communities, power structures, and perception, constantly evolving even when it appears static. It's a profound reminder, I think, that the past is constantly being reinterpreted, reconstructed, and that the names and labels we use, even now, might still be subtly shaping, maybe even limiting, our understanding of diverse spiritual paths and historical groups, maybe without us even realizing it.
So, the next time you hear that phrase, people of the book, maybe pause for a second. Perhaps you'll think a little deeper about what that book really holds, who put it together, in what order, and maybe who else. Who else might deserve a place in that storied, but perhaps much larger and more complex, library of human faith? It's certainly a reminder that history, and religious history in particular, is far more complex, contested, and utterly fascinating than the simplified narratives we often inherit.